and thank you for joining us for an on-location bookmark with the Catholic Marketing Network in Somerset, New Jersey. And we've come upon a good friend of ours here at EWTN, Mr. Al Kresta, to talk to Al about dangers to the faith, recognizing Catholicism's 21st century opponents. Always great to see you, Al.
Likewise, it's wonderful to be with you.
Our viewers know you from being an author now, and but certainly the radio show for years now, Ave Maria, and of course us carrying on our EWTN network.
In fact, there's an explicit thanks to you and Mike.
Right, I did notice that. That's very nice of
for
you.
your kindness.
Nice of you to put that in there. And you also have a book with a whole litany of people right at the beginning.
Yeah, which you
with
are.
a lot of praise. Scott Hahn and Matthew Kelly and Matthew Bunson and Teresa Tomeo, Michael Novak and Joe Pierce and Paul Kengor. Now this is a book where you're stepping out a little bit. I mean, you're kind of going out there because a lot of people don't like to talk about. What do you mean? There's enemies? We're all, and everything's basically kumbaya. We're going to be okay. There's some minor differences, but if we sit down and talk a little bit, it'll all be fine. You're seeming to want to show that, as much as that may be true in some cases, there's also other cases where it's a little more difficult for us to do that, right?
Indeed. Yeah, look, America has changed. It is a much more pluralistic society, and at one time when we talked about America's pluralism, we were talking about Catholic, Protestant, and Jew, all monotheists, all the biblical tradition. Well, now it's a different world. Since the 1965 change in the immigration laws, a lot of Hindus, Buddhists, South Asian people who have a very different approach to, metaphysical reality. And of course, we've got Islam now. And we've also seen the academic world change. So we've got, I think we have to acknowledge that we are, believing Catholics, serious Catholics, who are committed to the magisterial teaching of the Church, we are a real minority. And
even among Catholics.
Even among Catholics, and that's right. And we need to remember that, because a lot of times I think we know we've got the truth, right? And we act as though it's self-evident to everybody. It's not. And we need to recognize that as a minority, we have to figure out how to love our enemies. We had Mother Teresa who taught us how to love Christ in his most distressing disguise. We need somebody to model for us how to love our enemies now, because we have enemies, not just opponents, but actual enemies who are out trying to discredit the Catholic Church. Not everybody who opposes us is bent upon that, but there are now actual organizations intending to undermine Catholic teaching. And as minorities are subject to certain types of temptations. It's easy to grow bitter because you see the dominant culture mocking your leaders, for instance. It's easy for minorities to grow resentful because the things that you hold dearest are ignored by the culture. We need to not fall into that. We have as a minority people, we have a different way, and our way is to love our enemies, love our opponents, which means, first of all, listening to what they actually say and being able to represent their teaching in a way that they would recognize as fair and accurate. Then, of course, we can critique it. We can put it in its proper place. But love requires listening to our opponents.
Well, it's interesting, too. I'm thinking in terms of the use minority. And here in the United States, where there's an incredible sympathy for minorities and their positions on issues, many times it seems even to the exclusion of avoiding the downside of anything because it's a minority group. But yet Catholics and certain Christianity is certainly not seen as a minority case here by the secular culture at all. It doesn't get any treatment like that.
No, we get none of the benefits that go with being a minority. We get treated as though somehow we're responsible for everything that's going wrong in American history, especially in this case Protestant evangelicals. But Catholics are considered blame people for, they're being blamed for what went wrong in Western civilization. When in fact, if you take a look at the Catholic record, the world owes a debt to the Catholic Church. We were responsible for the scientific revolution, for the human rights revolution, and even on something like sexual expression. You read Pope Paul VI Humanae Vitae today, and it looks like a prophetic statement.
Without a
and
doubt,
yet
right.
nobody, the world won't recognize that.
Well, in a way, if it wasn't for the church, there wouldn't have been a Galileo to have a problem with.
Well, exactly. Yeah, and he is used now as the lens through which we understand the Catholic Church's teaching on science. He's not. He's one, not our best moment, but
Right.
the Catholic Church actually supported Galileo. We have this one problem with him, but the face of Mother Church in the area of the sciences is beautiful. Galileo represents a tiny zit on that face.
Right. That's a colorful
Yeah.
way of putting it.
Well, that's trying to get the balance
But you
right.
get names like Copernicus and people like that. You know,
An
people don't
archdeacon,
really, yeah,
yeah.
exactly. And they just think they're scientists. Well, they were, but they were also religious or tied into the church in some fashion.
Many of the modern scientific disciplines have a Catholic at the beginning of them. The founder of modern genetics is an abbot, Gregor Mendel, Mendelian
Right, sure.
genetics.
Right, sure.
The father of the Big Bang Theory is a Catholic priest, Lemaitre. The inventor of penicillin is a Catholic. But father of acoustics. You can go down the list, and I do actually do that in
Right,
the book.
in the book itself.
And you can see what Catholics have contributed to the common good in this area of science.
Right. Now, you alluded to it, and let's go back to it, because this is the kind of thing people like to understand. When we say we know our opposition, some people go and say, well, I'm not sure who the opposition is, because, but you list out here, the book gives you tools to deal with competing, you call them competing visions of secularity, Islam, New Age, Eastern thought, and so on, in popular conversation. These opponents take many forms. Some are blatantly false ideas, some are outrageous journalistic abuses, some engage in the shadow world of spiritual warfare. How did you come about quantifying who those opponents are?
Well, because of doing the program over many years now and just listening to people talk, I began asking, where are the threats? Where are we most vulnerable? I excluded the life issues and same-sex so-called marriage issues, simply because people have treated those so well already. And there were other topics I thought I wanted to make sure were in here. So I took things, remember the Da Vinci Code debacle?
Sure.
That's actually part of a much bigger problem that we're facing, and that is a group of certain academics who, coupled with pop culture folks like Dan Brown, who are trying to redefine the origin of Christianity and its history. There's a massive movement now where they're trying to rewrite the early church to demonstrate that the earliest bishops were not so much great teachers as they were crafty politicians who were interested in consolidating their particular Orthodox party and imposing its narrow vision upon the Jesus movement. This was more serious than I think people realize. National Geographic, for instance, a few years ago, did a special on the Gospel of Judas.
Oh, right.
Right? So most people could care less about an alleged Gospel of Judas. The only reason most lay people would be interested in the Gospel of Judas if they thought that it really was the Judas that's mentioned in the New Testament.
Of course it's not. Right.
And this Gospel is not.
Right.
It's an invented story from the 3rd century. A heretical group put it together. But National Geographic, in its publicity,
A lot of them are Gnostic Gospels.
That's right.
Right.
And actually, this is
Right.
one of the Gnostic Gospels.
Right.
National Geographic, in its publicity, though, did everything it could to imply that there may be some connection here with the historical Judas. They had a special translation done. They had a masterful special on television. They had a coffee table book. It was a big thing. Scholars looked at that and they said something's wrong here, because Judas was portrayed as a kind of courageous, heroic figure. 6 months later, a scholar, an expert in this particular field, retranslated it and noticed that they had gotten key phrases wrong in their haste to get it on television near Holy Week. They'd gotten key phrases wrong, and in fact, the Gospel of Judas presents Judas as a demonic figure.
Was it haste or ratings?
Pardon?
Meaning, did they do it and make the mistake because it was haste, or did they make some decisions that making him look like a demon was not good for the show?
Yes, I think that was part of that movement of trying to redefine historic Christianity. And so the greater contrast you can get with from the traditional version, the better.
Well, it seems like what it is that people have the need to believe. They have to connect, especially Catholics, to their faith. And so these things that talk about it in a different way, they're interested in.
Sure.
Because they're looking, oh, maybe there's new information. People like that.
Yeah.
The Gnostics knew that, the secret knowledge.
That's
Everybody
right.
likes to feel like they're on the inside, getting the inside story. I mean, a lot of people have websites where you sign up for extra money to get the inside scoop. That's what people, they like to be in the know. Now, one of the things here, you're right up front here, from New Age to the new self-styled spirituality of Oprah. Okay, what does Oprah have to do?
Well, I try to use some recognizable figures from popular culture. They're kind of icons. Oprah is an icon of what I call the new self-styled spirituality. Steve Jobs is the icon of the new self-sufficient man of technology.
I see, okay,
We've got Carl Sagan there, who's now passed on, but Sagan
Our
still
cosmic,
functions,
man, right,
in the kind of secular scientist.
Right.
So I try to use these iconic figures. Oprah is, it's arguable, Oprah may be the most influential single influence in spirituality in America right now. 30% of people asked said that she had a more important spiritual influence on them than their pastor did. When we had, after 9/11, when we had the memorial crusade, the memorial service at Yankee Stadium, Billy Graham wasn't asked to MC it. The Pope wasn't asked to MC it. The Cardinals weren't asked to MC it.
Right.
Oprah was asked to MC it.
Right.
And that one, again, an entertainer. In many ways, a wonderful woman. I don't want to. The fact that she's wrong about who Jesus is doesn't mean she doesn't have any virtues.
Well, it's interesting you do say here, and this is good, Oprah's Jesus was made in America. World religions are built on theological propositions or philosophical ideologies. Christianity, however, is built on the identity of its founder. Who do you say I am? You are the Christ, Son of the living God. Jesus and Paul warned against false Christs, yet America fashions many Jesuses, functionally displacing the Jesus of Christian orthodoxy. You talk about the Jesus of Christian Science is a divine idea or principle, not a person. The Jesus of Jehovah's Witnesses, the first and greatest creature of Jehovah God, not divine himself. Some say he's Michael the Archangel, I believe.
Right.
The Jesus of the Unification Church is a Messiah whose work was frustrated by human evil. Jesus of the I Am movement is the ascended master. We hear a lot about that. The Jesus of John Allegro is consumed as the sacred mushroom. So that's the problem. A lot of times today when we deal with people who are talking about things spiritual, they take the word and they pour new meanings into it, and unsuspecting people think they're talking about the same thing.
Yeah, it's very misleading. They use the same vocabulary, but they use a different dictionary.
Right.
And Oprah does this all the time. And again, all I want to say is that she believes in a Jesus that's an invention of 19th century America. It's the Jesus of the mind sciences that began in the 19th century. Unity schools, Christianity, New Thought, Christian Science.
Right.
Jesus is a way shower. He's not the Savior. He's not the Lord. He's a way shower so we can attain to the Christ consciousness just as he did.
Yeah, the cosmic Christ and all those kind of things.
Yeah.
I thought, what is it? Were we really here to go to worship or workshop? Because it seems like what we've replaced worshiping with is workshop. We're going to workshop ourselves into whoever the new person needs to be. That it never seems to take though. Not long term, right?
Well, in this tradition that she's in, Doug, they are continually talking about discovering yourself, redefining yourself, and ultimately what you're trying to do is discover the maximum about yourself. Well, what is that? You're God. She's in part of a movement that wants to discover our own divinity. Right.
But when what we need to find out is that we're not, and that we might have divinity in us, but it's because God was residing in us. Yeah. Well, that's the thing. The search for ultimate knowledge is good in that way. It's just we have to make sure we're on the right road.
Yes.
Or we'll end up in the wrong destination.
National Catholic Register just had a piece that Dan Burke wrote about dangerous forms of prayer. And a lot of it has to do with, are you praying to God, or are you meditating upon yourself? And in Oprah's
Which
tradition,
is a very Eastern thing.
very Eastern, and very much part of this 19th century mind science group, which relied heavily on early translations of South Asian spiritual classics from Hinduism and Buddhism.
Right. Well, component number 3, the East and the West, the case of reincarnation. Do we really have a lot of people in the West now believing in reincarnation?
We do. And it's not so much that this reincarnation is false. As Scripture teaches, it's appointed unto man once to die and then the judgment. But I use reincarnation there as one particular doctrine, which is part of a whole worldview, which is best associated with Hinduism, but South Asian spirituality. And that has had a powerful influence in America. About 25% of Americans, including Catholics, say that they believe in reincarnation.
Right. What do you think? What's the allure of that in your mind? Why do you think that's alluring to you?
In the West, it's you get a do-over. It's the idea that you believe in, we have biological evolutions. Well, this is spiritual evolution. I just keep coming back and doing it over and over and over again.
Until I
keep
get it right.
retaking the test until I'm perfect.
So in some way, I have the safety of knowing I'm going to live again.
Yes, and it's
I'm covered.
Reincarnation is being able to say, I'm not going to die. It's a way of avoiding confronting your own mortality. And I believe that there are many attractions that reincarnation presents to the West, but there's a wicked irony here. Eastern people, Hindus and Buddhists, don't like reincarnation.
Right.
They want out.
Right.
You know, the West, people want to be reincarnated. In the East, they say, no, that's tragedy. We want out. We don't want to come back again.
Right, but the difference is those people in the East are living a life that is very hard and difficult in many places.
That's right.
In the West, you've got a lot of this Zen kind of approach to things for upper class people who aren't necessarily unhappy with the life they're leading.
That's
here.
right.
And so in themselves, since coming back and doing it again,
revise it a bit, make it a little more.
Sounds like, well, maybe if I'm doing a little better the next time, that's even better, without understanding the punishment aspect of holding people back.
Right.
You know, or a karmic idea that, if you do something bad, well, you're going to have to pay for that in the next. You're not always moving ahead.
Right. Well, what's interesting is that one of the appeals, and people have said this, one of the appeals of reincarnation is it gets rid of hell and the idea of that final judgment. And although reincarnation is based on the idea of karma, as you pointed out, and this inviolable law of what you sow is what you reap, which in the Bible is a proverb. It's not an ironclad law. Even though they say that, they do find ways around it, because if a young, let's say, 9-year-old girl was trampled by her horse, if you're a Hindu guru, you don't go to the parents and say, well, in a past life, she mistreated mares, and so she got what was coming to her. They don't believe. I mean, but their teaching would imply that, but they won't live that way. They won't accept that. So they always are interjecting grace and mercy in order to live with their idea of karma. They have to come up with a personal. They're always smuggling in the concept of a personal, merciful God in order to live comfortably with their idea that the impersonal law of karma is governing my life. And actually one way of evangelizing, and I've done this a few times with people influenced by Eastern spirituality, is you point that out to them. That, look, you're not being honest with yourself here. You're borrowing from Western Catholic spiritual traditions in order to soften the hard doctrines of Hinduism.
Well, that's what they do. They take what they like, and then they pour in the Christian part that they like, and this new amalgam.
Yeah, that's the new self-styled spirituality.
That basically allows them to kind of feel spiritual but not be responsible for anything.
That's right.
Which is a very comfortable way to go through life, or seemingly comfortable way to go through life. But the other thing which is underlying here that you get to in the book is that ideas that were seen as different, or the new age 20, 25 years ago, are so mainstream now. They're just accepted. People, even good people, will in a sense will put something in a context without realizing they've accepted this idea, which is not a Christian idea.
Right. Yeah, I almost felt sheepish about putting in a chapter on the New Age movement because it seems so
Dated.
1980s.
Right, yeah, so dated, right, yeah.
But it's still out there, but you're right. It's become part of the culture. Our medical institutions have begun on the fringes, have used New Age ideas to make people comfortable. Americans have moved away from a belief in a divine judgment. That has been largely done under what we would call New Age influence. But that movement begins really in America, begins in the middle of the 19th century with the American transcendentalists, Henry Thoreau and Ralph Waldo Emerson. And eventually it gains momentum with the mind sciences at the close of the 19th century.
But the thing is, you wish these people had a better sense of history, because if they did, they would look back at these experiments and find out they didn't work.
Oh, that if we could wave a magic wand and make change, becoming aware of history would save people so much trouble, because these things have been not only thought before, they've been lived before. And we can take a look at how they lived out this experiment in faith. And we find that it's not been fruitful. We have all these occultists, people who do seances, divine readers, and we can look generation after generation and see what they say and whether the predictions held true or not. And they don't. They don't have any inside track on spiritual reality.
But since it's not true, they can always change it, or wash it away, or eliminate it, or go away from it and say, that's a misunderstanding, that's a misreading.
Yes, they love to redefine, which is one of your R's, I think, by the way.
Right, that's right.
I told Doug, he's got 3 R's that I think help define this book real well, and that's relativism, reductionism, and redefinition. And redefinition is a key way of avoiding the mistakes and sins of the past. You redefine the past, so you don't have to bear the burden of that history. And in the New Age tradition, they've done that over and over and over. It's always, the universe always begins the day I was born. You know?
Well, in some ways, that's the way a lot of us think, right? Well, you talk about Islam and you talk about scientism, but since we're running out of time and use the 3 R's, let's talk about relativism. Our last Holy Father, Benedict, he talked a lot about relativism and just that idea of, well, you have here, what is relativism? Christianity asks, isn't the Trinity wonderful? New Ageism asks, isn't my divinity wonderful? Secular humanism asks, isn't our humanity wonderful? Hedonism asks, isn't pleasure wonderful? Pragmatism asks, if it works, it's wonderful. Buddhism says, nothing is wonderful. Hinduism says, all is wonderful, with a 1. Egotism says, I am wonderful, no question. And relativism ends it with, if it's wonderful for you, now that's wonderful.
Right.
Where did you get those?
I saw something that got me thinking this way.
Right.
Some list.
But just because it's wonderful for you doesn't mean it's wonderful for you.
Right. And that's what it is. The relativist will say that he believes that 2 contradictory propositions can be true. So you can believe one thing, I can believe the opposite of that same thing, and yet somehow they're both true. Relativists don't believe that there's a universal standard for truth, beauty, or goodness. They believe that all things are relative to the individual or the culture. And there are many things you could say about that, but one thing I want to get across, and that is that while people, when they're asked, seem to answer questions as though they are relativists, when you get to know them, you find out they're not really. They've just adopted a different moral code that they'll impose on you as quickly as we might impose a more traditional morality on there. So if you're no longer crusading against adultery, now you will crusade against obesity. Or they take traditional morality and they re-engineer it because they have to have a code to live by. When they tell their kids, be good, they don't really mean that relativistically. They do have some idea that they think is binding on the conscience of that kid, and that really is binding on all kids.
Well, it's that whole idea of tolerance, the raising up of toleration. You're supposed to tolerate everybody else's opinion, but for some reason when it comes to their opinion on something that you disagree with, well, you're a bigot if, when you might say, well, no, we just disagree.
We just disagree.
And can't you tolerate my opinion? And they're not. And Monsignor Smith, the late great Monsignor Smith from New York, used to say, you scratch a liberal, you get a fascist. And sometimes when you deal with people in this kind of relativistic phase, not only do they have a different opinion from you on one subject, they have two opinions on two different subjects that don't coincide with one another. That on each on their own, that's what they believe, and you try to put them together. But don't you see how these things they can't work together? And it's like, it doesn't matter.
No, that's in their thinking. They think they can accommodate all of these incompatibilities, but when they're forced to live it out, they will impose their morality on you. That's one of the dangers in our own society. We see it going on with the state now. We have a kind of a new Caesar, which sees its own social morality as superior to the church and the synagogue and the family. It isn't as though the state's relativistic. It's that they invented a new moral code that they will impose on us when they get the opportunity. So Ted Turner wants a new 10 Commandments. He doesn't want 10 suggestions. He wants 10 commandments, but he wants them new. He wants to write them himself.
Right, and certainly we're all supposed to obey them, because now, it's like going back to Martin Luther. Everybody should be able to interpret the Bible as long as it matches what I believe it is. Right? Most of us are pretty open-minded until it's what we're saying is being contradicted or questioned.
Right.
Then suddenly we got a problem with it. Dangers to the faith, recognizing Catholicism, 21st century opponents. Let me just ask you a couple of things before we leave. There is good news, though, right? Yeah. There's some good news out there.
There's, the rise of Catholic media is good news. We talk about Catholic radio in particular because I'm so close to that.
Sure.
That's almost an entirely lay-driven movement. Mother.
The true call of Vatican II, really.
Yeah, really.
Right.
Mother Angelica said, go out and get radio stations, and I'll provide the programming. Okay, people went out there, but who did it? Not priests and bishops. Lay people went out to do this, oftentimes, most of the time, without any radio background. And they started the Catholic radio movement. That's good news. That's a real bright sign. I think these Catholic men's movements that we're seeing are new. There's a lot of positive things. There's a great time to be Catholic.
Another book in the works?
Well, about a dozen of them, and that's my problem, is I have a hard time focusing. So.
Hey, well, you're not writing books, you're listening to them in your van. I know that. That's great. Thank you so much, Al.
Hey,
always great to have you here. Keep up
you.
the great work on radio. Speaking with Mr. Al Kresta. Kresta in the afternoon on EWTN Radio Network, Ave Maria, and his book, Dangers to the Faith, Recognizing Catholicism's 21st Century Opponents. I highly recommend it. It's published by our Sunday Visitor, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Join us next time. Thank you for being with us here on location at the Catholic Marketing Network.